The first signs weren't explosions or dogfights in the sky, they were quieter than that. Aircraft that didn't return from routine missions, flights canceled without explanation, factories that once ran day and night suddenly going dark for weeks at a time. On paper, Russia still possessed one of the largest air forces on Earth. In reality, something inside it was already dying by the time the world noticed. The damage was no longer reversible, and according to analysts watching from the outside, the countdown to a full aviation collapse had already begun when Russia crossed into Ukraine. Its air force was supposed to be unstoppable. Hundreds of modern combat aircraft, decades of institutional experience, and a reputation built on Cold War fear. The numbers alone looked overwhelming. Against Ukraine's much smaller fleet, the outcome seemed predetermined. Air superiority was expected in days, maybe weeks, but that moment never came. Russian jets didn't dominate the skies. They hesitated, they pulled back. They began operating farther and farther from danger. What looked like caution at first slowly revealed itself as something more disturbing. Vulnerability. Months passed. Then years. The war didn't end, and the Russian aerospace forces began flying in ways they were never designed to fly. Sorties piled up, airframes aged faster than planned. Maintenance schedules were stretched, then quietly ignored. Aircraft that should have been rotated out of service stayed in the air because there was nothing left to replace them. Each flight hour became a debt the system couldn't afford to repay. Behind the scenes, the factories were struggling to keep up appearances. Sukhoi plants announced production targets, but deliveries slipped, numbers were adjusted downward. Timelines blurred. What the public saw were press releases and parades. What engineers saw were missing components, idle machines, and entire production lines, waiting on parts that would never arrive. Sanctions didn't destroy the industry overnight. They poisoned it slowly, cutting off the precision tools and electronics that modern aircraft can't exist without. Russia had built its aviation empire on a fragile assumption that access to global supply chains would never truly disappear. German machine tools, Japanese precision equipment, Western avionics, specialized components sourced from half a dozen countries. For years, these imports were quietly embedded into Russian production. When the doors slammed shut, there was no backup waiting inside. Import substitution was promised. It was announced, it was funded. But in practice, it failed to replace what was lost. One plant became a symbol of this quiet collapse. Inside its walls sat high-end machining equipment designed to operate at extreme tolerances, the kind of machines that make the difference between an aircraft that flies and one that never leaves the ground. These tools were aging. Their accuracy guarantees were expiring. They required replacement parts that could no longer be purchased. Engineers knew what was coming. When those machines failed, entire segments of the aerospace industry would fail with them at the same time. The people who knew how to keep everything running were disappearing. The average age inside Russia's military manufacturing sector climbed. Year after year, young engineers looked at shrinking salaries, rising risks, and a future defined by conscription and isolation. Many left some quietly, others permanently. The knowledge stayed behind in aging minds, while the next generation built careers elsewhere. Factories began competing with each other for workers, pulling talent from civilian projects to military ones, then back again, like organs being transplanted between failing bodies. Losses at the front only made the pressure worse. Aircraft were destroyed, some were shot down. Others simply wore out, flying too often, too hard in conditions they were never meant to endure. Every loss demanded a replacement, but replacements arrived slower than losses accumulated. In some years, Russia lost aircraft at nearly the same rate it could produce them in others. The losses quietly outpaced production. The margin for error vanished. Older jets, once the backbone of the fleet, were pushed aside. They had too few flight hours left. Too many structural limits already exceeded. Some were cannibalized for parts. Others were kept in reserve, not because they were ready, but because no one knew what else to do with them. The Air Force began shrinking, without officially shrinking, a hollow force still large on paper, thinner every month in reality. To adapt, Russia changed how it fought. Instead of close-range bombing runs, aircraft began launching weapons from farther away. Glide bombs became the solution, cheap, destructive, and terrifyingly effective. Old bombs were fitted with guidance kits and wings, allowing jets to strike without entering heavily defended airspace. From a tactical standpoint, it worked. Aircraft losses dropped. Ukrainian positions were smashed from a distance, but the aircraft still had to fly. Takeoff, transit, release, return. The hours kept accumulating. The wear never stopped, and glide bombs brought their own weakness. They required precision components, navigation modules, electronics, manufacturing chains, just as fragile as the aircraft factories themselves, a system built on bottlenecks, a system that could be disrupted if someone knew where to strike. By 2025, Ukraine had learned exactly where those pressure points were. Long-range drones reached deeper into Russian territory, not symbolic attacks, but targeted ones. Aviation plants, assembly halls, storage facilities, each strike sent a message. Nowhere was truly safe anymore. Damage didn't have to be permanent. Even temporary shutdowns were enough. Delays stacked on delays. Schedules collapsed into uncertainty. While the military struggled, civilian aviation began unraveling even faster. Russia's airlines were built around Western aircraft, hundreds of them Airbus, Boeing planes, that needed constant access to foreign spare parts. When sanctions cut that access, airlines turned to gray markets, smuggling components through indirect routes. Maintenance standards slipped. Aircraft spent more time grounded. Entire fleet shrank as planes were parked indefinitely, stripped to keep others flying. The government promised a domestic solution. New airliners, hundreds of them. A future where Russia would no longer depend on the West. But the factories couldn't deliver. Year after year, production numbers missed their targets by staggering margins. Not dozens, short hundreds. In some cases, only a single aircraft emerged, where dozens had been promised. Airlines began warning of bankruptcy. Routes disappeared, remote regions lost air links. The illusion of normality cracked. The truth was unavoidable. Military and civilian aviation were inseparable. They shared factories, workers, tools, and supply chains. When one suffered, the other bled. Parts meant for passenger planes were redirected to fighter jets. Military resources were pulled to patch civilian failures. Nothing was stable. Everything was borrowed from something else. Inside the Kremlin's industrial strategy, choices became impossible. Protect the military and let civilian aviation die. Save civilian aviation and accept reduced military capability. Try to sustain both and watch them collapse together. No option. LED to victory, only to delay. By the end of 2025, analysts stopped asking whether Russia's aviation industry was in trouble. The question became how long it could continue functioning at all. Aircraft were aging out faster than they could be replaced. Factories were constrained by tools they couldn't repair. Workers were vanishing. Export markets were collapsing. And beneath it all, the war continued, demanding more from a system that had almost nothing left to give. The skies over Ukraine were no longer just a battlefield. They were a countdown, and as 2026 approached, the silence between takeoffs began to stretch. Longer than anyone was willing to admit, the silence didn't mean peace. It meant exhaustion as fewer aircraft lifted off. The pressure on the remaining fleet intensified. Every jet still capable of flying became more valuable and more fragile at the same time. Maintenance crews were forced to make impossible choices, deciding which planes would receive the last usable components and which would be quietly written off. Aircraft weren't retired with announcements. They simply stopped appearing on flight logs. The numbers shrank invisibly. Inside Russia's aerospace factories, the strain became impossible to hide. Production schedules existed only on paper. Machines sat idle not because of a lack of orders, but because the precision tools they relied on had crossed their operational limits. Some were still running, but only barely, their tolerances drifting outside what modern aviation demands. Engineers knew what that meant. Microscopic flaws today became catastrophic failures tomorrow. The margin for error had disappeared, and the system was running blind. Workforce shortages deepened the crisis. Entire shifts were missing. Skilled engineers were reassigned from one project to another, sometimes within the same week. Civilian aircraft programs lost workers to military contracts. Then military plants lost them again when salaries couldn't keep pace or when conscription loomed. Universities continued producing graduates, but fewer stayed. The most capable left early, chasing stability abroad or simply refusing a future defined by crisis management. Russia tried to compensate by stretching everything it already had. Aircraft lifespans were extended. Engines approved for limited service hours were kept running past their design thresholds. Paperwork replaced inspections. Temporary fixes became permanent solutions. Every shortcut added risk, but grounding aircraft entirely would have been worse. The Air Force chose to accept the danger at the front. Doctrine adapted again. Aircraft stayed farther back. Missions became shorter. Older jets were kept out of contested airspace altogether. Some types vanished from the war without explanation. Their absence spoke volumes. They were either unfit to fly or too valuable to lose. In both cases, they were effectively gone. The glide bomb strategy continued, but it too began showing cracks. Production targets were ambitious, almost desperate. Tens of thousands of guidance kits were ordered. Factories worked to their limits, drawing from the same strained supply chains. Already failing elsewhere. Precision navigation modules became the choke point. Without them, the bombs reverted to dumb iron. Ukraine understood this and began targeting the infrastructure that made those modules possible. Deep strikes multiplied. Some failed. Some succeeded just enough. A damaged plant didn't need to be destroyed. Even a temporary shutdown rippled outward. Assembly lines paused, deliveries slipped. Stockpiles thinned. The bombing campaigns didn't stop, but their tempo wavered. The illusion of endless supply was breaking. At the same time, Russia's economy began feeling the weight of aviation collapse in unexpected ways. Air travel inside the country became less reliable. Delays turned into cancellations. Routes were cut entirely. Regions that depended on air links felt isolated. Airlines raised prices to survive. The public noticed the sense of normal life eroded, replaced by quiet frustration and unease. Financial pressure mounted. The government raised taxes. Subsidies shifted toward military industry. Civilian aviation lost support just as its problems peaked. Airlines warned they couldn't survive another year. Some didn't. Grounded fleets became graveyards of stripped aircraft, their parts harvested to keep a shrinking number of planes airborne. Externally, Russia's reputation as an aviation power collapsed. For decades, it had sold fighter jets across the world, offering affordability and independence from Western systems. The market evaporated almost overnight. Potential buyers watched the war closely. They saw aircraft losses, they saw supply failures, they saw delays. Trust vanished. China filled the vacuum where Russia once dominated. Chinese aircraft now appeared modern, affordable, backed by a functioning industrial base. Former Russian customers quietly shifted their interest eastward. Even longtime partners reconsidered their dependence on Moscow. Without exports, Russia lost more than money. It lost the funding that once fueled research, development, and future designs. The flagship projects suffered most. Advanced fighters that were supposed to symbolize technological revival remained rare, almost mythical, deployed sparingly if at all. Export versions failed to attract serious buyers. Promises replaced deliveries. The future remained perpetually just out of reach. By now, the pattern was clear. Every problem fed another. Sanctions restricted components. Production slowed, aircraft aged. Losses increased, workforce shortages worsened. Exports collapsed, funding dried up. Each loop tightened the spiral. Analysts began comparing the situation to other historic collapses, not sudden crashes, but drawn-out declines, where institutions continued functioning long after their foundations had rotted away. On the surface, flights continued. Bombs fell, factories operated. But beneath it all, the system was consuming itself. Ukraine faced its own impossible choices. Strike oil infrastructure and choke the economy, or strike aviation production and save lives. On the battlefield, each drone could only hit one target. Every decision traded long-term damage for immediate survival. The war became a calculation, of which future collapse mattered more. As 2026 approached, Russia's options narrowed. It could sacrifice civilian aviation, completely grounding fleets and isolating regions, to keep the Air Force alive a little longer. It could preserve a minimal military capability and abandon offensive operations, or it could continue drifting, making emergency decisions week by week, hoping something would break in its favor. None of those paths led to recovery. They only determined how visible the collapse would be and how fast it would arrive. The skies were still busy, but they no longer felt permanent. Each takeoff carried the weight of the system that might not be able to support the next one. In somewhere between the factories, the airfields and the battlefront, the question was no longer if Russia's air power would fail, but when the failure would become impossible to hide. By the time the world began openly discussing collapse, Russia's aviation system was already past the point of control. What remained was inertia. Aircraft kept flying not because the system was healthy, but because stopping would expose the truth all at once. So the pressure was distributed, instead spread thin across factories, airfields, pilots, and mechanics who were asked to do more with less, until something finally gave way. The oldest aircraft became liabilities. Some were grounded quietly, never officially retired. Others were flown sparingly, reserved for patrols far from danger, their remaining flight hours treated like a finite currency. Maintenance crews worked with shrinking inventories, improvising repairs, swapping components between aircraft, keeping one jet alive by sacrificing another. It was aviation by triage. The newer fighters carried the burden of the war. They flew the glide bomb. Missions launched from safer distances, returned and did it again. The strategy protected pilots, but it accelerated exhaustion. Engines degraded, airframes accumulated stress fractures, invisible until failure. Every sortie pushed the fleet closer to a cliff that no amount of tactical adaptation could move. Ukraine's deep strikes continued to probe the system's weakest points. Aviation plants, storage depots, electronics manufacturers. Each successful hit forced emergency repairs, emergency rerouting, emergency decisions. Production didn't stop forever. It stopped just long enough to miss deadlines, long enough to create shortages that cascaded through the network, long enough to remind everyone how fragile it all was. Civilian aviation unraveled further. Entire regions saw air service reduced to a fraction of what it once was. Airlines merged, downsized, or vanished. Aircraft sat grounded for months, waiting on parts that might never arrive. The public felt it in delays, cancellations, and rising fares. What had once been a symbol of modern connectivity became a source of anxiety internationally. Russia's aerospace industry faded from relevance. Arms exhibitions that once showcased confidence now felt hollow. Buyers asked questions Moscow couldn't answer. Delivery timelines were uncertain. Support guarantees were meaningless. The reputation built over decades dissolved in a matter of years. China's rise made the contrast impossible to ignore. While Russia struggled to sustain production, China scaled it. While Russia rationed advanced aircraft, China fielded them in numbers. For countries seeking alternatives, the choice became obvious. Russia was no longer the reliable supplier it once claimed to be. Inside Russia, planners faced a future with no good options. Preserving a minimal air force meant abandoning offensive ambitions. Saving civilian aviation meant accepting military decline. Trying to do both meant slow collapse on all fronts. The strategy that emerged wasn't really a strategy at all. It was delay by time-shift resources. Make it through the next quarter, the next year, the next crisis. But time wasn't on their side. Aircraft don't wait, machines don't recover. Skilled workers don't return easily once they're gone. Every month of war consumed resources that couldn't be replaced. Every year narrowed the path forward. By 2026, the collapse wouldn't need to be declared. It would be visible in grounded fleets, idle factories, canceled routes, and shrinking sortie rates. The skies would tell the story on their own. This wasn't a sudden fall. It was a slow implosion driven by overconfidence, isolation, and the brutal math of modern warfare. A system built for short conflicts was being asked to sustain a long one, and it was breaking under the weight. And this story doesn't end here, because the consequences of this collapse won't stop at Russia's borders. They'll ripple outward, reshaping military balances, global arms markets, and the future of air power itself. If you're listening to this from somewhere in the world right now, tell me where you're tuning in from. And if you want to keep following the stories that expose what's really happening behind the headlines, make sure you're subscribed to Global Focus. More deep, unsettling Global Focus are coming soon, and the next one may be closer to home than you think.